Assalamu alaikum dear students. From today I am going to upload the videos on one more programming language, C++. We know that C++ is the object oriented programming language. In this video we will discuss what is object oriented programming language and how object oriented programming language are different from procedural oriented programming language. Or we can say, in today's video we will discuss what is the difference between object oriented programming language and procedural oriented programming language, and why we need procedural object oriented programming language. Every minute introduction regarding the object oriented programming language will be discussed in today's video with the help of the diagrams. As we know that what is programming language? Actually, programming language is the language which is used to provide the instruction and data to the computer system. Or you can say, in order to communicate with the computer system, we need languages, and those languages are called programming languages. So, from today I am going to upload the videos on the programming language C++. We know that C++ is the object-oriented programming language. What is object-oriented programming language? In order to understand the object-oriented programming languages, it is mandatory for us, it is important for us to know what is procedural-oriented programming language, because first there was a procedural oriented programming, then after procedural oriented programming there comes another paradigm, another type of programming languages. Those are the object oriented programming languages. So whenever we communicate with the computer system, we use some high level languages. In order to communicate with the computer system, we use high level languages. High level languages can be broadly classified into two categories. High level languages can be broadly classified into two categories. First one is the procedural oriented programming language, and second one is the object oriented programming languages. And in procedural oriented programming language, there comes under this category comes C language, Fortran language, and basics. These are the programming languages which comes under this procedural oriented programming languages. And under this category, object oriented programming language, there is the C++ is the programming language which comes under object oriented programming language category, and Java is also a programming language that comes under this object oriented programming language. So first we will see what is procedural oriented programming methodology, or we can say what is procedural oriented programming languages. Here I will write down a structure, I will draw a structure of this procedural oriented programming language, and with the help of that structure we will discuss what is procedural oriented programming language and what are the demerits of this procedural oriented programming languages. So in procedural oriented programming language, because in order to understand object oriented programming languages, we must know first what is procedural oriented programming languages. In this case, procedural oriented programming language, here main program, or you can say a big problem, is divided into smaller sub problems the big problem. For example, it is going to be divided into this is our main program, a big problem that is going to be divided into smaller sub problems, or we can say in this type of programming, in procedural oriented programming methodology, a big program is divided into smaller sub-programs which can be further divided into sub-programs, and these smaller programs are called functions. This is function 1, this is function 2, this is function 2, 3, this is for example a function 4, and this is function 5. So we can say in procedural oriented programming, a main program, a big problem, is divided into a smaller programs which can be further divided into sub-programs, smaller programs, and those smaller programs or smaller parts are called functions here. Okay, what is procedural oriented programming? What happens in this type of programming? In this type of programming, a big problem, a big program, a main program is divided into a smaller sub-programs which are further divided into sub-programs according to our need. So here, this is a main program, for example, it is divided into these following parts, fragments, and these smaller parts are called functions here. Okay, so this is function 1, function 2, function 3, and function 4 and function 5. Here this function 2 is further divided into 4 and 5 as per according to our need. And in this type of programming, global data. This global data is going to be shared by all the functions of this program. In this procedural oriented programming, the global data is going to be shared by all the functions. That means this function 1, function 2, function 5, function 4 and function 3, all these functions have access to this global data. That means every function can access this global data here. So we can say in procedural oriented programming, each and every function of the system of the big program, of a big problem, can access the global data. That means the global data can be accessed by all these functions, and there is the apprehension, there is the chances that any of these functions can update, or you can say modify their global data. So we can say the modification in any of data of any of these functions can affect the other data of other functions as well. In case of this procedural oriented programming methodology. So in procedural oriented programming methodology, the global data is going to be shared by all the functions, all the sub-programs of the main program. So any of these sub-programs can access the global data and can modify that as well. So we can say in this procedural oriented programming, the data is not safe. Data is not safe. The security of the data is not going to be maintained in this procedural oriented programming. This is the main disadvantage, main drawback of this procedural oriented programming. In procedural oriented programming, the data has been given the second preference. First preference is given to the procedures, or you can say the code or the algorithms. That means how to do, what to do, not how to do. That means the maximum, the priority, the importance is here given to the procedures rather than on the data. But as we know that the data is one of the most important resource, the priority must be to the data. But here in case of procedural oriented programming, the priority is given to the procedures or algorithms rather than on the data. This is the main disadvantage or drawback of the procedural oriented programming methodology. So in order to overcome this procedural oriented programming methodology, a new approach comes, a new way of thinking, a new paradigm, new way of solving the problems come into existence, and that is called the objective oriented programming methodology. In object-oriented programming methodology, the importance was given to the data rather than on the procedures. Okay, hope now you understand what is the structure of this procedural oriented programming. In procedural oriented programming, a large program is divided into smaller programs, which can be further divided into sub programs, and those smaller programs are called here functions, and all these functions can access the global data. That means the data in this in procedural oriented programming moves freely around the system. That means every function can access the data of any other function. So data is not secure in this procedural oriented programming. And second type, that in order to develop the complex and large softwares, this procedural oriented programming is not suitable. Why? Because here each and every function can access the data of any other function, and those softwares which requires continuous maintenance, frequent maintenance, cannot be developed by using this procedural oriented programming, because due to the second importance of the data. I now hope that you understood what is procedural oriented programming. So we can say in procedural oriented programming, as a large program is divided into smaller programs, which can be further divided into sub programs, and those small sub programs are called here functions. Number two, in this type of programming, the global data is going to be shared by all the functions present in the system. So the data moves frequently. We can say data moves freely around the system. So the data is not secure. Third point regarding this procedural oriented programming is that this type of programming follows the top-down approach. That means a big problem is divided into smaller problems, and later they are solved and then they are put together. And next point regarding this procedural oriented programming is that this procedural oriented programming is not used to develop the complex and the big softwares, large softwares. These are the demerits of procedural oriented programming methodology languages. In order to overcome these demerits, another approach comes into action, that is the object oriented programming. OOPS can also be said. Object oriented programming methodology. What happens in object oriented programming? Here also in object oriented programming, here also is a main program, for example. Data function, data function. This is a main program. In this, for example, this is a main program. In this type of programming, in procedural oriented programming, data functions, object 1, object 2, object 3 and object 4. In this procedural oriented programming methodology, here also a big program, a large program is divided into smaller components, smaller fragments, and here those fragments are called objects. In this type of programming, in object oriented programming, a large problem is divided into smaller problems, smaller fragments, and those fragments here are called objects. And here each object contains its own data and functions. This is the data and function, and this data and the functions are encapsulated in a cover. There's a cover around the data and the functions. So no one outside this object can access the data of object 1. We can say here this cover provides the security to this data, which was the main disadvantage of the procedural oriented programming. In object oriented programming, both data and the functions are variable into a single unit, and that unit is called as an object. That means everything in object oriented programming is treated as an object. What is an object? Object, anything about which we want to store a data is called an object. For this is a pen. This is a pen. For example, if this is a pen and this is a pen object, it has some properties, or you can say it has some data. For example, color, price, brand, and it has also some functionality, such as we can write, we can use it as a ruler as rule. We can use this as a ruler as well. So these are the functions and these are the attributes. We can say these are the data associated with the pen and these are the function associated with the pen. Both these pen data as well as the functions are variable into a single unit, that is called an object. So here only the data does not move throughout the system, because object 1 have its own local data and functions. Also object 2 have also its own data and functions. Object 3, these data and functions, these objects are not here interdependent to each other. They are not interdependent to each other. That means the data which are required by this function are present in this object as well, and also the data which is required for object 2 is present here also. So here the chances of unauthorized access are very low, because here the data does not move freely in the system in case of object oriented programming methodology. Here objects can also communicate with each other. Yes, the object 1 can also communicate with object 2, but by using message passing mechanism. Here the message passing mechanism is used to communicate the objects with each other. That means there is some mechanism through which the objects can communicate with each other in object oriented programming methodology, and that is called the message passing, which we will discuss in next videos. So here we can say in object oriented programming, the data does not move freely in the system. That means here the first preference, or we can say the importance is given to the data rather than to the function, rather than to the functions, or rather than to the procedures or code or algorithms. That is the main advantage of this object oriented program, and by this way it provides security to our data, which is one of the most important feature of the object oriented programming methodology. We can say the object oriented programming methodology come into existence because of the security purpose, because it provides the security to our data due to by using the mechanism of data hiding, encapsulation, which we will discuss in coming videos. So we can say in object oriented programming, a large program is also divided into smaller fragments, which can be further divided into smaller fragments, and those fragments and those smaller subprograms here are called objects, because each object contains data and function associated with that function. Every object have data and functions. Every object have data and function. That means the interdependence here is very less. But in case of procedural oriented programming, there the functions are very interdependent to each other. That means every function, the global data is going to be used in procedural oriented programming. But here in object oriented programming, every function, every object have its own data. Here also the objects can communicate with each other by using the message passing mechanism. And third point regarding this object oriented programming methodology is that here the bottom up approach is going to be followed, while as in procedural oriented programming the top down approach is going to be followed. So we can say that this OOPS, object-oriented programming methodology, is a safe programming methodology. It provides security to our data by supporting the various, we can say, various features such as classes, objects, encapsulation, polymorphism, inheritance, and message passing. Inshallah, all these features of object-oriented programming will be discussed in next videos. I hope now you have understood what is the difference between the object-oriented programming methodology and procedural-oriented programming methodology, or you can say why we need procedural object-oriented programming methodology. Inshallah, in the next video we will start the introduction. We will start the basics of C++ language, or we can say introduction to C++. So object-oriented. So C++ is the object-oriented programming language, not pure object-oriented programming, but it supports the various features of the object-oriented programming languages, C++, and Java is the pure object-oriented programming language. Hope now you have understood what is introduction to object-oriented programming methodology, or you can say object-oriented programming language. Inshallah, in the next video we will discuss the introduction to C++. Till the next video, take care. Bye bye.